The wedding hall was the kind of place that made you feel underdressed just by walking through the door. Gold accents on every surface. Crystal chandeliers throwing soft light across tables set with china I was afraid to touch. Adrian had planned every detail of her wedding the way she planned everything. For maximum impression. From maximum distance. I had made her gift myself. A ceramic bowl, hand-thrown and hand-painted over 3 weekends in the small pottery studio I rented space in. Deep blue glaze with a pattern of small leaves around the rim. It had taken me longer than anything I had made before, and I had wrapped it carefully in tissue paper and brought it to her wedding with the quiet pride of someone who has put real time into something. Adrian picked it up, turned it over once, and looked at me with her eyes narrowed. "Seriously," she said. Loud. "Carrying." "That's it." Laughter moved through the nearest cluster of her friends like a small wave. Every head turned. Every whisper landed. I smiled and said nothing. "My name is Susan, and thank you for listening to my story of betrayal, resilience, and justice. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Are you on your commute, taking a break at work, or cozy at home? Share it in the comments so we can connect and swap stories like this together. If this story pulled you in, don't forget to subscribe, give it a like, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next real-life drama. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation and the justice going. I found the bathroom on the far side of the reception hall and stood at the sink with the water running cold over my wrists. My fingers were steady. That surprised me. I had expected them to shake, the way they sometimes did after something that hit harder than I let show on my face. But they were perfectly still. The fury inside me was not the hot, reactive kind. It was the other kind. Quieter. The kind that does not need an immediate exit. The kind that simply sits down, folds its hands, and begins to think. Adrian had laughed at a gift I had made with my own hands in front of everyone she knew. She had called me out in the middle of her own wedding reception, in a room full of people I had never met, with the easy confidence of someone who had done it before and expected no consequences. She always expected no consequences. I looked at myself in the mirror above the sink. One day, I said quietly to my own reflection, "She will see exactly who I am." I meant it in a way I had not quite meant anything before. The post-wedding brunch was smaller, immediate family only, at my parents' house the following morning. I arrived early and helped my mother set the table, which is how I ended up standing in the kitchen when she said, quietly, without looking up from the fruit she was slicing, "You know how Adrian is. She's always been all smoke and mirrors." My father, pouring coffee at the counter, made a sound of agreement that carried years of tired patience in it. They were not telling me anything I didn't know. But there was something different about hearing it said plainly, without softening, in the ordinary light of a Sunday morning kitchen. "She's going to run into a wall someday," my mother said. "The lifestyle she's building, it's borrowed." I nodded and carried the fruit bowl to the table. Adrian arrived 40 minutes late, kissed everyone warmly, and spent the first 20 minutes describing her honeymoon plans. At one point, she glanced around my parents' modest dining room and made a small comment about my apartment, something about how it must be cozy, with the light, amused tone she reserved for things she considered beneath her. I passed the orange juice and said nothing. 3 days after the wedding, I drove to the office of the family solicitor and asked to review the trust documents in full. I had known about the trust since our grandfather died 4 years earlier. He had set it up quietly, without announcement, and left the management of it entirely in my hands. I was the executor, the trustee, the sole person with legal authority over how and when the funds were distributed. Adrian was a named beneficiary. That much she knew. What she did not know, what no one had told her, because no one had thought it necessary to explain the legal structure in detail, was that her access to those funds was entirely subject to my discretion. The trust was not automatic. It did not simply release money on a schedule. Every distribution required my approval, my signature, my judgment about whether the conditions our grandfather had outlined were being met. I sat in the solicitor's office with the documents spread across the table in front of me and read every page carefully, the way I should have read them when I first became executor. By the time I left, I understood the full shape of what I held. 2 months after the wedding, Adrian hosted what she called a welcome home gala, A party celebrating her return from the honeymoon that was really, as far as I could tell, an opportunity to show people her new house. I attended. I wore something plain and arrived without making an entrance. I found a spot near the edge of things and stayed there, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, watching. Adrienne moved through the room the way she always did. Bright, magnetic, the absolute center of everything. She had a gift for it that I had always genuinely acknowledged, even when it exhausted me. People gravitated toward her the way they gravitate toward anyone who seems completely certain of themselves. What I was watching for was not the performance. It was what the performance was covering. And I found it in pieces over the course of the evening. The careful way she steered conversations away from specific numbers. The slight tension when someone asked directly about the house, how they had managed such a quick purchase. The way her husband Owen refilled his drink twice during those conversations without contributing to them. The lifestyle was stretched. I could see the seams. I noted everything quietly and drove home through the dark. The family gatherings continued through the season, and at each one Adrienne found an opportunity. A comment about my car. A passing remark about my apartment building. A question about whether I was still doing the pottery thing, delivered in the tone someone uses to ask whether you're still going through a phase. I never responded directly. I answered questions plainly, kept my voice even, moved the conversation forward without accepting the frame she was trying to put around me. Inside, I was not struggling to contain anger. I was doing something that felt more like filing, taking each moment and placing it accurately in my understanding of who she was and what this situation actually was. At one dinner, Adrienne mentioned the inheritance casually, something about when things come through, in a way that suggested she thought of it as a scheduled arrival. Like a train she had a ticket for. She did not look at me when she said it. She had no idea that I was the one who decided whether that train ran at all. I had been a supporter of the Harlow Community Arts Fund for several years, quietly, anonymously, the way I preferred to do most things that mattered to me. When their annual fundraising gala came around that spring, I made a larger contribution than usual. Significant enough that the fund's director called to thank me personally and asked if I would allow my name to be acknowledged at the event. I said yes. The acknowledgement happened to appear in the event program that was distributed publicly and also covered in a brief piece by a local lifestyle publication. Adrienne was an enthusiastic public supporter of the arts. She had attended the Harlow Fund Gala the previous 2 years and considered herself part of that social circle. I heard from a mutual acquaintance named Rosie that when the coverage appeared, Adrienne's friends began asking questions. Someone had seen my name and mentioned it to her. She had apparently stared at the program for a long moment before saying something vague and changing the subject. She was not used to my name appearing in rooms she considered hers. I found that quietly satisfying in a way I did not feel the need to share with anyone. The cracks became visible in the autumn. Rosie, who moved through the same social circles as Adrienne without being particularly loyal to either of us, mentioned over coffee that Adrienne's credit situation had become a point of whispered conversation among people who paid attention to such things. High balances. Late payments on the house. The honeymoon, it turned out, had been financed in ways that were now creating pressure. Owen was doing his best, from what Rosie understood, but Adrienne's spending had not adjusted to match the reality they were actually living in. She had gone to my parents for help. My parents, gently and with genuine regret, had explained that the estate funds were no longer in their hands, that the trust was managed independently, that they didn't have what she was looking for. I heard this secondhand through my mother, who called me that evening with a careful voice that was trying to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. Several days later, Adrienne received formal correspondence from the solicitor's office. The letter explained that any distributions from the trust required a formal request, reviewed and approved by the executor. The executor's name, printed clearly at the bottom of the letter, was mine. I reviewed the trust documents again that week, this time with a different quality of attention. The funds were substantial. Our grandfather had been quietly careful with money his entire life, the kind of man who lived simply and invested consistently and said very little about either. What he had built over 60 years of that discipline had accumulated into something that would have surprised most people who knew him. The legal structure he had chosen was specific and deliberate. Distributions were not guaranteed. They were discretionary, subject to the executor's judgment, guided by a set of principles he had written himself into the trust's founding documents. Principles about responsibility, about demonstrated stability, about whether a beneficiary's circumstances reflected the values he had wanted to reward. He had chosen me as executor because, he had written in a private letter I found with the documents, he trusted my judgment and my patience. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I began thinking carefully about timing. At a family gathering in October, I mentioned, casually in the course of a conversation about investments, that I had recently restructured some of my personal finances and was feeling settled about the direction things were heading. It was true. It was also understated in a way that left room for people to ask follow-up questions. Two of my cousins did. We talked briefly about index funds, about long-term planning, about the value of patience over quick returns. It was an ordinary conversation that would have attracted no particular attention at any other table. At this table, Adrienne was sitting 4 seats away. I didn't look at her directly, but I was aware, in the peripheral way you become aware of someone who is suddenly paying close attention, that she had stopped talking to the person beside her. Later, as people were gathering coats, she approached me with a smile that was working slightly harder than usual. "Since when are you the financial expert?" she said, light teasing, the tone she used to make pointed things sound playful. "I've always paid attention to it," I said simply. Just quietly. She studied me for a half-second longer than the conversation required. Then she laughed and said goodbye and walked to her car. I found the letter from our grandmother while going through a box of things my parents had set aside after clearing the last of the estate storage. It was addressed to me, written in her handwriting, careful, slightly slanted, the penmanship of someone who had been taught to write as though it mattered. She wrote about patience. About the years she had watched me work at things without needing anyone to notice. About the pottery, specifically. She had seen a piece I made when I was 24 and had kept the photograph of it in her bedside table. "I had not known that," she wrote. * Your grandfather and I always knew that the quiet ones carry the most. Not because they have to. Because they choose to *. I read it 3 times sitting on the floor of my parents' living room. The anger that had been sharpening itself quietly since the wedding reception did something different when I finished reading. It didn't disappear. It refined. It became something cleaner and more purposeful. I knew what I was doing and why I was doing it. I also knew when. Rosie and I had coffee again in November. She was one of those people who existed comfortably at the intersection of several social worlds without being fully claimed by any of them, observant, honest when asked direct questions, discreet about the difference. I had always liked that about her. I told her in general terms that there was a family situation developing and that I wanted to handle it carefully and well. I didn't ask her to do anything. I didn't share information I shouldn't share. I simply told her that things were going to become clearer soon and that I valued her straightforwardness. She nodded and said she appreciated being told directly rather than finding things out sideways, which was how most things traveled in the circles we both moved through. That afternoon, Adrienne posted a video on her social media, a tour of her living room, showing off new furniture she had apparently just purchased, full of the bright, easy confidence of someone who had no idea what was moving toward them. I watched it once and closed the app. The irony was genuinely remarkable. In early December, I agreed to sponsor a small exhibition at a local gallery, work by 3 emerging artists from the pottery studio I used, including 2 pieces of my own. The exhibition was modest. A Tuesday evening opening, perhaps 60 people, wine and soft lighting, and the specific quiet pleasure of a room full of work that had been made carefully. My name was on the sponsorship plaque at the entrance. A photograph from the opening appeared in a regional arts publication the following week. Someone shared it in a group that included several of Adrienne's closest friends. I was mentioned by name as both sponsor and exhibiting artist. The response was small but real. A few messages from people I knew, a comment from someone I had not spoken to in years saying they hadn't realized I was doing this. Adrienne sent me a text 2 days after the publication appeared. It said, *saw the gallery thing. Good for you, *. 3 words of genuine acknowledgement, wrapped in 4 of careful distance. She was noticing. She just didn't yet know what she was noticing. The years of it came back to me sometimes in quiet moments. Not the wedding reception, that was only the most recent installment. The years before it. The comments about my apartment, my car, my choices, my apparent lack of ambition by the metrics Adrienne used to measure ambition. The way she introduced me at her social events. My sister, she does pottery, with a pause after it that did the work of an eye roll. The assumption, consistent and unexamined, that I was the lesser version of us. That my quietness was evidence of limitation rather than preference. That the life I was building, deliberately, patiently, according to values I actually held, was simply a smaller and sadder version of the life she was performing. I didn't sit with that anger in a way that felt consuming. I sat with it the way you sit with information, letting it tell you something true about the situation, then using that truth to make better decisions. The final reveal had taken its full shape in my mind. It needed to be public. It needed to be undeniable. And it needed to be, in the deepest sense of the word, honest. Adrienne hosted a brunch in January for a group of her closest friends and a handful of family members, the kind of event she organized every few months to maintain her social position and remind people of her taste. I was invited, which I took as either confidence or habit, possibly both. I arrived at exactly the stated time, dressed simply, and found a seat near the window. The table was set beautifully. She was genuinely skilled at this, and I acknowledged it. The food was good. The conversation moved easily. I contributed normally, laughed, listened, responded when addressed. Nothing about my behavior signaled anything different. But I was watching. Adrienne made 2 jokes at my expense during the meal. Small ones, the kind she would describe as teasing if anyone called them anything else. Something about my very minimalist lifestyle and something about how I probably didn't need a reservation for places she was describing. Both landed with light laughter from people who were following her lead. I smiled and ate my food. The brunch had confirmed what I needed to confirm. She had not changed. She would not change on her own. I had a conversation with the solicitor the following week. I wanted to be completely certain of the process. What it would look like from Adrienne's perspective, what she would be told and when, what rights she had and what she didn't. I needed to understand the full legal picture before the next step, so that nothing I did could be characterized as unfair or procedurally irregular. The solicitor confirmed everything I had understood from the documents. The trust was legally sound. My role as executor was clear and protected. Adrienne's access to the funds was discretionary, not guaranteed, and any legal challenge to that structure would be both expensive and very unlikely to succeed given how clearly our grandfather had written his intentions. Word had apparently reached certain people in Adrienne's social circle, through the natural movement of information in communities where finances and legal matters occasionally intersect, that something related to the estate was in motion. I heard from Rosie that Adrienne had started asking careful questions at gatherings. Nothing direct. Just the kind of subtle information gathering that people do when they sense something approaching and aren't sure what shape it's in. The room was beginning to shift around her without her understanding why. I watched the change happen in stages. The first stage was confusion. Adrienne was used to being the person other people oriented toward, the one asked for opinions, recommendations, introductions. When that dynamic began to quietly redistribute, she noticed it without being able to name it. The second stage was defensiveness. She became slightly sharper at social occasions, quicker to establish her ground in conversations, more likely to mention her house or her connections or her plans in ways that felt like responses to questions nobody had asked. The third stage, and this was the one that told me the timing was right, was a kind of brittle watchfulness. She began paying attention to me at family events in a new way. Not the dismissive, occasional attention of someone who considers you a minor fixture. The alert, slightly anxious attention of someone who suspects the landscape has changed but can't find the new map. I felt no cruelty about this. What I felt was a steady, clear sense that the truth was becoming necessary. Not as revenge. As reality. Some people only stop building on a false foundation when the false foundation is named. The family dinner in February was the moment I had been waiting for. Not because I had engineered it specifically. It was an ordinary occasion, my parents' anniversary, the kind of dinner we had every year. But the full family was there, including Adrienne and Owen, and the atmosphere had the natural warmth and openness that made truth easier to speak and harder to deflect. Toward the end of the meal, in the way that conversations shift at long dinners when the plates have been cleared and people are comfortable, the topic of the estate came up. Not through any action of mine. A cousin asked my father something about how things had been settled after grandfather's passing, the kind of question people ask when enough time has gone by. My father answered simply that everything was in order and well managed. Adrienne, from across the table, said lightly that she was still waiting to understand the timeline for the inheritance. She said it with the casual confidence of someone who considers themselves entitled to an answer. She looked at my father. My father looked at me. I set down my glass and spoke clearly, without raising my voice. The trust distributions are managed through me, I said. That's been the legal structure since grandfather established it. I'm the executor and trustee. Any distribution to any beneficiary requires my review and approval. The table went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when something lands that changes the arrangement of the room. I had brought the relevant documents with me, not to perform anything, but because I believed that truth stated plainly is more powerful than truth implied. I placed them on the table. Not dramatically. Simply, the way you place something that needs to be seen. This outlines the structure, I said. The conditions for distribution, the discretionary nature of the executor's role, the principles grandfather wrote into the founding documents. I slid the papers toward the center of the table where they could be read. Adrienne stared at them. Then she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Genuine, uncalculated shock. The color left Adrienne's face in a way that had nothing to do with the lighting. She reached for the documents. Not quickly, carefully, the way people reach for things they need to read again because the first reading cannot possibly be correct. She read. Owen, beside her, read over her shoulder. His expression moved through several stages and settled on something that looked like the quiet resignation of a person confirming something they had half suspected. There has to be a mistake, Adrienne said. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. The bright, carrying voice she had used at her wedding reception to ask Asterisk seriously. That's it. Asterisk was entirely absent. There isn't, I said gently. Grandfather was very specific. I've had the documents reviewed multiple times. The structure is sound. She looked at me across the table. I think she was searching for something in my face. Anger, satisfaction, the gleam of someone enjoying a reversal. I don't believe she found it. What I was feeling was not enjoyment. It was the sober, clear feeling of something true finally being in the room with us. Why didn't you tell me? She said. You didn't ask, I said. You assumed. The room recalibrated slowly. My cousins, who had been quiet since I placed the documents on the table, began to ask careful questions, not challenging ones, genuinely curious ones. They had not known the details of the trust structure either. The conversation that followed was practical, factual, and completely ordinary in tone, which somehow made it more clarifying than any dramatic confrontation could have been. Adrienne did not participate in that conversation. She sat with the documents in her hands for a while, then set them down, then picked up her wine glass and held it without drinking from it. Owen answered a direct question from my father about where things stood practically, with the measured honesty of someone who had just been relieved of a pretense he had been carrying for some time. Adrienne attempted once to reframe the evening, a light comment about how complicated estate law was, how easy it was to have the wrong impression. It fell without catching. The people at the table nodded politely, and the conversation continued in its factual direction without picking up her frame. She was not used to being unable to steer a room. I did not press further. That is the part one want to be clear about, because I think it matters. I had not brought the documents to the table to humiliate Adrienne. I had brought them because the truth had been absent from our family's understanding of this situation for too long, and that absence had allowed a set of assumptions to solidify that were not fair to anyone, including, in the long run, Adrienne herself. When the conversation moved on and the documents were set aside and my mother brought out the anniversary cake and the room softened back into something more celebratory, I let it soften. I did not make additional points. I did not return to the subject. I helped clear plates and told my father his speech had been genuinely lovely and talked to my cousin about his new job. Adrienne was quiet through most of the rest of the evening. Once, catching my eye across the table, she opened her mouth slightly as though she was going to say something. Then she closed it and looked away. The justice did not need me to narrate it. It was already complete. In the weeks that followed, Things settled into a new arrangement. The trust distributions, which Adrian had been mentally spending for some time, I gathered from a careful conversation with Owen, were now understood to be subject to a process. A real one. Not a formality. She submitted a formal request through the solicitor, as the documents required, and I reviewed it against the conditions our grandfather had established. I was fair. I want to say that clearly. I did not use my position to punish her or to withhold what was genuinely owed. What I did was apply the actual criteria, thoughtfully, carefully, in the way I believed our grandfather had intended. Some of what she had expected to receive, she received. Some of the discretionary additions she had assumed were automatic. She did not. The difference between those two things was the difference between an entitlement and an inheritance. Between what she had assumed and what was actually real. She posted less on social media. The furniture tour video quietly disappeared from her profile. She did not make any comments about my apartment. 3 months after the family dinner, Adrian came to my studio. I was working when she arrived. Hands in clay, a bowl taking shape on the wheel, the particular focused quiet of a Saturday morning when nothing external requires anything of you. She knocked on the open door and stood in it, looking at the room, at the shelves of finished pieces, the works in progress, the tools hanging neatly on the pegboard, the 2 large windows letting in the flat gray light of an overcast morning. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Yes," I said. I finished the curve I was working on and then stopped the wheel and reached for a cloth. She sat down on the bench near the window. She didn't speak immediately, which was unusual for her. She looked at the shelves. "The bowl," she said eventually. "The one I laughed at." "Yes." "Did you really make it yourself?" "Over 3 weekends," I said. "In this studio." She was quiet for a moment. "It was actually beautiful," she said. "I knew that when I saw it. She stopped. Started again. I didn't know how to be in a room with something I couldn't match. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. I told her I appreciated her saying it. We talked for an hour. Not about the trust. Not about the money. About our grandfather, mostly, and what he had understood about people that most people miss. She left without reconciliation being declared. But something had opened. Spring came and I kept working. New pieces on the wheel. A second exhibition in the planning stages. A mentorship arrangement with 2 younger artists from the studio community who had reached out after the December show. The trust was administered and documented and reviewed on its proper schedule. I took the responsibility seriously, the way our grandfather had intended it to be taken. Not as power, as stewardship. My life looked, from the outside, exactly as it always had. The same apartment. The same modest car. The same quiet Saturdays in the studio with clay on my hands and the radio low in the background. What was different was harder to see from the outside, which is exactly the way I preferred it. I had spent years being the sister who didn't need to be noticed to know her own worth. That had always been true. What the past year had clarified was that quiet confidence and genuine power are not opposites. They are, when built on real things, exactly the same. Our grandfather had understood that. He had left me his trust not because I needed the authority, but because I already had the character that makes authority mean something. The ceramic bowl Adrian had laughed at was on a shelf in my studio. I kept it there on purpose. Not as a reminder of the humiliation. As a reminder that I had made something real with my own hands, and that had always been enough.